All right. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Yes. Oh, very good. Excellent. Good. Love a good interactive audience. I know this is against lunchtime, so I'm going to try to be as concise, helpful, and useful as possible. Before we get into the discussion itself, I have a couple of announcements to begin. So in general, all ReMA events, we follow our antitrust guidelines, our code of conduct. All of those materials you can find here on the lady in her little outfit on the chairs. So please review that if you have any questions. We do have ReMA counsel here in the corner. Rebecca is in the back. I'm gonna make sure everybody knows Rebecca. So if there's any questions or comments about anything that you think might be in violation of any of our antitrust guidelines, please let us know. We generally try to steer clear of anything that's competitively sensitive. Don't want to talk about future pricing, production levels, anything like that. So any questions, please review that or let Rebecca know. Please also make sure to turn off your cell phone or set it to vibrate. The emergency exits, I think, are pretty well labeled. The ReMA Connect app is the best way to receive updates about the convention, about events. Do we have any members of the media here today? I know I've already had one member introduced. Okay. Just as I'm the only speaker, so it's not just relevant to me, though, in the event that you do ask a question during the Q&A session, just as a reminder, we do have media here, so keep that in mind. All right, so I'm the lone speaker today, so I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of heads up as to the circumstances of the situation. So everything that's happened, I think you're all well aware of what's going on, what's happening in the trade world. And so we've had to kind of call a little bit of an audible here. There's been some developments in terms of who was able to join us, who was able to participate in this session. So I have been giving to ReMA members, I've been giving essentially weekly trade and tariff talks. So if you're a ReMA member and you are familiar with what I'm talking about, great. If you're not a ReMA member and you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're about to kind of get a flavor for what I do every week for our members. You are a ReMA member and you don't know what I'm talking about, please find me afterwards, or please find one of our communications team members, and they can kind of give you the information as to how to register. So what I've been doing ever since probably early March, given everything that's happening with the Trump administration, I've been doing every Thursday afternoon, we've been reviewing all of the latest trade and tariff developments that have been going on in the U.S. So this talk today is going to be very China focused, but China focused as it relates to the U.S. So we did have some panelists from China who were originally going to join us, but due to some circumstances beyond our control, we had to kind of pivot away and turn it into this trade and tariff talks. So very quickly about me, I am ReMA's VP for Trade and Global Affairs. We do all sorts of advocacy work on behalf of our members. I lead all of our trade and global affairs efforts. So if you are getting member alerts from us related to trade, it's probably coming from me. Again, if you're not receiving that, that's a member benefit. We will go over a lot of that at the end as to what we do have for our members. But I just want to kind of set the stage here a little bit before we go into a lot of what's directly happening. Now, this is old already. I've been using this kind of as a starting point. This was from about a month ago now. This was also before we got the announcement earlier this week about the pause, or the temporary pause in the tariff duty rates with China. But there's a lot of potential downsides we see. You know, our industry is very trade dependent, trade focused, trade heavy. And so I think we are at a unique both advantage and disadvantage to take advantage of some of these situations that are coming out of the tariff policies out of this administration. So the WTO is really starting to recognize that we're looking at significant, deep declines in trade within North America. Now, the efforts with China, the developments that happened earlier this week, I do think that hopefully that will improve, make this situation a little more tenable for U.S. recyclers, for North American recyclers, and for anyone else involved in this industry. But we saw a lot here in the U.S. This is also a few weeks old now at this point, but it really shows the trends of what's happening in the broader trade context here in the U.S. and as it relates to China. We see that some of the ocean bookings, the changes in ocean bookings are down by between 2/3 coming from the U.S. or coming from China to the U.S. and by about 1/3 in terms of U.S. exports to China. So, the U.S. industry itself, the U.S. recycled materials industry itself is very export driven in terms of Southeast Asia and China. So we've been very concerned not just about the import tariff situation that's involving trade in recycled materials, but also potential retaliation. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just want to kind of set the stage as to what's on our mind, and I'm sure what's also on your mind. So, trade broadly in the United States. Where are we in terms of U.S. exports, U.S. imports? So it doesn't look that huge if you are looking at these charts. So yeah, we definitely import here more in the U.S. than we export. But if you look at the U.S. trade deficit, though, we're looking at over $1 trillion in U.S. trade deficit in goods, in manufactured goods and other goods. So how does that set the stage for the discussions and the thinking of what we're looking at coming out of the Trump administration? Well, with the European Union, with the EU 27, that's where we have the largest in terms of two-way trade, followed by Canada, Mexico, China, and subsequent down the line. But China does remain the largest U.S. trade deficit. This is data from 2024. I'm realizing is not on the chart, but it sets the idea for what our I think the biggest concern and biggest challenges are as it relates to the tariff programs that have been introduced by the administration. But importantly, I think we are an industry that exports and trades, but we are also all consumers here, especially if you're in the U.S. And so just in the first quarter of this year alone, we saw the lowest rate, I believe, since 2008 of China's share of U.S. imported goods. So it's down to 11% of U.S. imported goods came from China in the first quarter of 2025. And that is even before the actual reciprocal tariff action went into place in early April. So how does this all relate to us? Well, when I started at ReMA about 2 years ago, I knew we were very export-focused, export-oriented. I knew we also imported, 7-8 million metric tons of recycled material. Sorry, not scrap, from my perspective. But what I've really learned over the past couple of weeks, couple of months, as the import tariffs started to go into place, is so many of our members' businesses, so many of our industry's business is also reliant upon imports, and there's a lot of two-way trade that is happening here. So even though we are in terms of this is looking at tonnage and volumes, so we're still a significant net exporter here in the U.S. But in terms of value, we're exporting about $28 billion worth of recycled materials to the global marketplace. But in terms of imports, we're importing about 7 or 8 billion, I'm sorry. So we're looking at around the $20 billion trade surplus. And so when we're talking to the governments, when we're talking to officials who are making these trade policies, a lot of what's happening is being driven against U.S. imports. The tariff policies are generally import focused as a way for the administration to try to reshore and bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. But caught in the crosshairs, I think that is the potential for a lot of these exports of materials to get caught up, whether we've seen a little bit of retaliation, which we'll talk about as the presentation goes on, but there's a lot of potential disruption that we could see for our members and for our industry. This is just kind of going through a few data slides before we go into the major issues with, or the major announcements by the administration. This is what we're looking at, where our exports are being traded in terms of the products. So we've seen a slight decline in recent years. I think each subsequent year since 2021, we had declines overall from about 36, 37 million. I think last year was somewhere around 32. But steel and ferrous, excluding stainless, is the largest in terms of volume, followed by paper and fiber. I know the colors aren't great on this, so it looks like it's plastic, but it's really paper and fiber. So for this presentation, I think a lot of what we want to focus on a little bit is viewing the U.S. trade relationship with China. And so how did we get to where we were in terms of declines in U.S. exports? Well, a lot of this began about 12 years ago with Operation Green Fence, which I know everyone in this room is a lot more familiar with than I am. So I'm not gonna pretend that I was around at all and was involved in any of this, but this kind of set the stage and set the process by which China began to curb its imports of recycled materials of other solid waste products. A lot of the initial focus was on simply enforcing existing inspection regulations. I think something as high as 70 or 80% of the inbound materials, of inbound waste and recyclables started to become inspected, starting in 2013. That ultimately, of course, led to Operation National Sword, which, extreme contamination standards were, the contamination standards started to become quite stringent. There's a lot of dumping of waste and junk, for a lack of a better term, into the Chinese market, which resulted in this almost de facto import ban because of these strict contamination standards. And in particular, in the U.S., what we saw was also Chinese retaliation against U.S. exports, because the previous Trump administration had actually imposed significant rounds of tariffs starting in 2018, 2019. And so the U.S., we also saw significant, anything that was still able to trade really started to decline starting 2018, 2019. So you can see here how China represented around 35-40% or so about 10 years ago in terms of where U.S. exports of recycled materials were headed. Slowly 2017, 2018, which is when we really saw Operation National Sword go into effect, we really saw those numbers start to decline significantly. And then you'll notice, though, that this is just on volume. This is not necessarily on value. So we see 2024 still less than 10%, I believe, maybe like 6-7% of all commodities. But what did we see over the last couple of years? Well, we did see some efforts by the Canadian. Wow, I'm in a different room here. Sorry, by the Chinese government to relax some of these import restrictions, to relax some of these really high, strict contamination standards, particularly on the commodity grade and some of the on-spec material. So this all started to take effect last year. A lot of the materials had actually been flowing directly or indirectly anyway. So was this more of a way for the material, for the laws and the rules, regulations to kind of catch up? I think we can tell, though, because these rules started going into effect 2020 through 2024. But on a value basis, from what we're looking at in China, copper represents, almost 10% of all U.S. exports. So we're looking at almost, I think, about $2.7 billion U.S. exports to China. A little bit of aluminum here, some paperboard as well. Not a lot of steel, though. But I think this kind of, I'm not a copper expert, but this looks at where we've seen the growing both value, as I mentioned, and also the growing volume in terms of what is going to China in particular in the copper side. So I think that kind of sets where we are data-wise, and now I'm going to go into a little bit of what's happening here in the U.S. and how it's going to have particular effects on U.S. and China trade. So I like to start a lot of my talks, a lot of my presentations, a lot of my speeches based on, how can this happen? How can the president impose all of these tariffs on our trading partners? Isn't there some sort of separation of powers in the U.S.? How can one man just really do this without consulting Congress or without putting together some sort of really significant investigation or public comment period? Well, Congress actually has the full authority. They have the authority to regulate foreign commerce, impose tariffs, raise revenues. So that's a lot of what you're hearing coming out of the administration, though, and that's because Congress has really delegated so much of this authority over the past 100 years to the executive branch, to the White House, to the president. So before President Trump came into office, most of the tariffs that you've probably ever heard of were related to unfair trade practices, anti-dumping, countervailing duties. Those are ways to address unfair trade. So those are individual products that may be subject to a duty or two. Not a lot from the broad scale, significant action that what we've seen over the past couple of months. There's a couple others that crept up during the first administration, which we'll talk about in a minute. But really the last point here, the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that's, I think, where we're seeing so much of these tariffs imposed. And it's for a reason. It's because there's not a lot of guardrails on that. The president doesn't have a lot of there's not a lot of bounds as to what he can do here. And that's for better or worse. In his mind, he can make these, impose these tariffs, which IEEPA's never been used, for tariff authority in the past. So he doesn't have to follow an investigation. He doesn't have to get public comments as to whether or not this is a good idea or not. He doesn't have to do an economic analysis. But at the same time, these IEEPA tariffs are what is being challenged in court. And so whether they are upheld or not, if you've been in some of our other sessions that we've had on trade, this is probably the most, these across the board tariffs are probably the most vulnerable simply because of the statutes that the president has chosen to use. So quick refresher here on what happened during the president's first term back in 2017. The president had full control of Congress and the White House. He imposed various tariffs through some of the authorities, 201, for example, Section 232. I think that was big for our industry in particular, steel and aluminum tariffs. But for this group, for China, that was the imposition of about 60% of Chinese imports coming into the U.S. market were subject to the Section 301 tariff. Eventually, the president decided, though, once he lost the midterm elections, once the Republicans lost the midterm elections, to shift more towards renegotiation of the NAFTA, negotiation of other free trade agreements. But we did see something here. We saw that there was a lot of effort on some other areas, for instance, on auto imports that were left undone. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing so much action and so much activity so quickly within this new administration is because it took them really 2 years to get those first three actions done, 201, 232, 301. It took them the better part of 2 years to get tariffs imposed. And then they lost the House, and he really wasn't able to do anything else in terms of imposing tariffs in order to rebuild domestic manufacturing. So I think that's really why we're seeing things happen so quickly. These tariffs, I'm not going to go through this, but this is kind of the timeline as to what had taken place during the first administration. It took about 2 years, a year and a half or so, for the various tariffs to be raised on all sorts of products. There's not a lot of scrap coming from China into the U.S. market, so it wasn't as big. We do have a lot of concerns in terms of some of the manufactured inputs, the equipment purchases for shredder wear parts, for example, which we can talk about. But this kind of set the stage for where the president's views on China were. This investigation was related to intellectual property theft, tech transfer, other products or other processes and unfair trade practices that the president felt were really impacting U.S. commerce. So that ultimately, though, led to a phase one agreement in 2020, January 2020. I don't know how many people remember that agreement because something else happened in early 2020 that really took our eyes off the ball in terms of trade and trade negotiations. But the two countries did agree to an agreement where China committed to significantly increase its U.S. purchases. It's purchases of U.S. exports. They had a baseline. I don't even remember what the baseline was, but they agreed to basically commit to an additional $200 billion. So an additional $100 billion purchases each year on top of what they had already been purchasing the previous years. And as I showed you earlier, U.S. doesn't buy a lot, or I'm sorry, China doesn't buy a lot from the U.S. So $200 billion over a 2-year period is a significant amount of purchases. However, China did not reach that goal. They didn't even I don't think they even reached their baseline that they would have already committed to before they even got into that $200 billion. I think they had only imported about 58% of their baseline. So, I think this is what I'm hearing a lot of, is that our initial agreement may be kind of the basis for future negotiations between the U.S. and China. So what did we see then starting in 2021, 2025? Well, tariffs are a funny thing. Once tariffs are imposed, you get a lot of interested parties and interested stakeholders that really don't like them being taken away. So what we saw, the steel and aluminum tariffs and even the China 301 tariffs largely stayed in place during the Biden administration. Now, there were some country exemptions. I believe the European Union, EU, Japan, maybe one or two others that did receive some tariff rate quotas. There were also some, but however, the administration ended up removing a lot of the product exclusions on China from the tariffs. They also launched a couple of new 301 investigations, and they imposed some export controls on a lot of high technology, high tech sector and products. So I think the issue that we see with tariffs and trade is once these policies are put into place, it's really tough to take them away. So January 20th, the president signed a new executive order outlining what his goals are, what the method by which they plan to address a lot of the unfair trade practices. They wanted to look at existing tariffs, existing trade deficits. They wanted to look at significant trade deficits, review of trade agreements, currency manipulation, export controls. There is the China Phase 1 agreement, and also all in the process by which they want to increase revenues so they can continue to build their manufacturing base and also potentially use that for tax reform. For this group, though, for the purposes here, there's a lot of different tariff programs. It's really confusing. I myself get confused, even though basically I spend like 12 or 15 hours a day just looking at tariffs, just looking at what's happening. So for Chinese imports into the U.S. market, really what we're seeing is specific tariffs on China. So we're seeing some anti-dumping, countervailing duty measures. Those are primarily on finished products, steel, aluminum, others. There's also the Section 301 investigation, which we had talked about. The first really round of tariffs that we saw come out of this administration were these emergency border measures to address immigration and fentanyl and drug trafficking. That was also on Canada and Mexico, but Canada and Mexico have a carve-out at the moment. But China, we started to see an escalation starting at 10%, eventually raising to 20%. There's also these broadly applied tariffs. These are the 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, other potential investigations, and the reciprocal tariff actions. So we're going to go through these kind of one by one to give you a little bit of flavor as to how they impact China. As I mentioned, started out here 10%, eventually raising to 20% starting March 4th. Most tariffs, though, in the U.S., with the exception of some carve-outs, I think, in the auto side, tariffs generally stack on top of each other. So what we see here is starting March 4th, a lot of material, a lot of imports into this country were subject to the 301 tariffs, which was between 7.5% and 25%, stacking now on top of this 20%. So you could be paying as high as 45% before starting March 4th. China, though, retaliated against this, but not by imposing any sort of retaliatory tariffs. They decided to impose some limited export control measures, limited export restrictions on some some critical raw materials, some materials that are used in the high-tech sector. They didn't want to go as strong. They didn't want to go kind of tit for tat versus the U.S., at least on this program. Now, 232, we've talked about a lot here at this conference and at other conferences in the past for ReMA, because steel and aluminum are huge markets for recyclers for our industry. So what happened was the president decided that he wanted to fully reinstate all of these tariffs that had been slowly watered down over the years by himself, actually. He watered down tariffs on Canada, Mexico, for example, during his first administration. President Biden then further watered them down with some country exemptions, some product exemptions. But importantly, though, all of those country exemptions are gone, except now for the UK. We'll talk about that. The aluminum duty went up from 10% to 25%. There used to be a product exclusions process. That's now gone. And one area which I think is important for us to look at, and especially in the context of U.S. China trade, is bringing downstream products, bringing some derivative steel and aluminum products into the broad scope of the tariffs. When the tariffs were first implemented in 2018, there was an exclusions process, which I mentioned is now gone. Now, the president is actually imposing an inclusions process. So the White House is now asking for any additional tariff lines that domestic industries might want to include. However, importantly for us, this remains the case for this particular tariff program, scrap steel, and recycled aluminum are excluded from the scope of these tariffs. So these are just essentially any sort of steel mill or aluminum product after the melt and pour stage or the cast and smelt stage. That's kind of how the U.S. government has been looking at this. However, for us, though, and in terms of U.S. manufacturers, U.S. steel, or U.S. recyclers rather, shredder wear parts, which are an integral part of the operation and the mechanics of shredders, primarily been imported from China over the last couple of decades. Those are now subject to the aluminum derivatives list. Don't ask me why. We've already asked why, since they're mostly foundry products. Should be on the steel list, but the answer was then we'll just move them over to the steel list. So anyways, the important thing to note here is the tariffs are coming and hitting from all different directions. So it's not just something where if you're importing the scrap under IEEPA or under the reciprocal, there's all sorts of considerations and direct and indirect impacts that our members, and I know that a lot of international members, have to contend with. So the big action that really took place that I think got the biggest splash globally, the biggest splash in our industry was the reciprocal tariff actions. I believe it was called Liberation Day, April 2nd. It began with the imposition of this across the board 10% tariff, 10% duty on essentially all countries, except for Canada and Mexico. This applies to virtually every single product. It applies to any sort of recycled commodity imports, except for a couple that may be subject to other tariff measures. But if you're bringing in aluminum into the U.S. market from any country, or recycled aluminum from any country except Canada or Mexico, you're probably going to be paying this 10% duty. Now, this is, I think, really what caused a lot of the, I've been calling it trauma and drama, just internally, because there's so much happening and we don't really know all the potential implications of this. But the reciprocal tariffs, the higher duty that is subject to about 75 countries, including EU member states and China, that was where the real issue seemed to be, and was really what was driving a lot of the market drops over those couple of days in the immediate aftermath of April 2nd. So this is where we are seeing a lot of the basis for the negotiations between the U.S. government and the various foreign governments. There's also some potential for other 232 tariffs, for example, to be negotiated away. However, we're really not seeing any effort by the administration to look at removing this universal 10% baseline tariff. So what's excluded? What's excluded from these tariffs and what's not excluded, and why is it excluded? So the recycled materials on the left side seems like a lot, But in terms of volume, most of the volume that we are bringing into the U.S. market is on the right side. So generally your plastics, tires, paper, steel, except for stainless, aluminum, and any sort of electronics and batteries. Those are not excluded from these reciprocal or universal tariff actions. On the left side, why do we see these products? Why are these materials excluded from the 10% duties? Well, stainless steel, we still haven't been able to get a straight answer for this, but the rationale for any sort of exclusions from these tariffs are if you're paying a duty on something else. So if you're paying a 232 25% tariff on steel, aluminum, autos, auto parts, or if your material is going to be subject to a future 232 action. So that's semiconductors, copper, lumber. Help me out here. What else is, there's so many investigations. Pharmaceuticals, a couple of others. We're not going to make you pay this 10% tariff because you may be getting a higher tariff at a later rate, at a later time. Some of these other materials, though, there's not a lot of domestic processing or domestic production here within the U.S. So I think that's why some of those other zinc, tungsten, magnesium, it's an interesting conversation we've been having just because these are manufactured inputs and our industry or industries in the U.S. are relying on these. So why aren't these other manufactured inputs also excluded from the reciprocal tariffs? But we've had some conversations with the U.S. government, and it doesn't seem to be like a lot of daylight on that front. So how are the negotiations going? Well, as the markets really started to tank on, I think, April 7th, April 9th, April 8th, April 9th, we did see a 90-day pause in the full implementation of these higher tariff rates. So the EU had a 20% duty. I think Korea and Japan, they had in the 20s and 30s, for example. So every single one of those higher rates was paused for 90 days, except for China. Now, why did the administration not pause on China? Well, China decided that they were going to retaliate against the U.S. exports. So as you may recall, the U.S. does not export as much as China exports to the U.S. So there wasn't a lot of room for China to retaliate against the U.S. just in terms of dollar for dollar value. So China retaliated. I think China had originally a 34% reciprocal duty. So China imposed a 34% retaliatory duty. President then, I think the next day said, all right, we're adding another 50. China, Beijing added another 50. So I think we were at 84. Both countries were at 84. Then President Trump added another, my math's going to be bad here, added another reciprocal duty. So now it was at 125%. China then matched that 125%. The issue with imports from China, though, is because this 125% reciprocal duty isn't the only thing that is happening on the import duty side from China. We have the 20% emergency border tariff. We have other tariffs for 301. So I think you could be looking as high as 170% during this April 5th period to earlier this week. I think it might be today. Today might be the day that they eventually announced the pause. But we did see this 90-day truce through early August on the reciprocal and retaliatory tariffs. Both the White House and Beijing announced they would lower their retaliatory and reciprocal tariffs to 10%. So starting today or starting tomorrow, anything brought into the U.S. market will only be subject to the 10% reciprocal. It'll still be subject to the 20% emergency, but I think it's a better situation. Now, one thing that I think was lost on all of the media reports, however, and you'll notice the little second bullet there, in the event that this temporary truce, that this agreement doesn't result, or these negotiations don't result in an agreement starting, I think, August 12th or August 14th, it's not going back up to 125% for China. It's only going back up to 34%. That was listed in the implementation of the White House and the agreement between the president and Premier Xi. So the rate would then jump from 10 to 34% instead of 10 back up to 125%. So I think in this situation, cooler heads have prevailed. Now, what exactly is the White House looking to negotiate on? a whole host of things here, not just on tariffs on U.S. exports, but lots of other non-tariff measures, other unfair practices that the White House believes is the case. So I have a couple more slides, and then we can kind of go into some questions, because I know there's a lot of uncertainty about what applies to what, where the tariffs are for various products, for various imports. One area where we've really engaged as an association, and I'm not trying to pitch a lot of the work that I do, but this was an area where we really felt that we had a lot of potential influence in with the administration. So as we've talked about, the U.S. is a very export-focused, export-driven industry for the recyclers. And so the administration had announced significant proposed port fees that would really limit the ability of U.S. exporters to trade internationally, because any ship, any vessel produced in China or operated by a Chinese shipping company, or if you were using one of the Dutch or one of the other shipping companies that had a Chinese-built vessel in their fleet, those vessels would also be subject to these $1 million port fees. So we spent a fair amount of time in April, given everything else happening with tariffs, advocating against this action, filing comments. I testified at a hearing, doing a lot of meetings with the administration, and ultimately we were able to secure some significant exemptions, which we thought were helpful and useful for the industry. So I think that's generally. Oh, I do have one more slide. So where do we think this is going? What's next? What's going to happen? A lot of what I think as I mentioned at the beginning, everyone thinks that maybe Congress is going to step in if the pain is felt acutely enough. Well, it seems to me that given some of the most recent economic data that we've heard in several of the sessions this week, and the fact that the most aggressive tariffs, the most aggressive duties, at least are on pause, both for most of the world, but also now with China, I think that's probably pulled the relief valve here on Congress really taking any action. There had been a couple of resolutions that were working their way through the system, but right now the House and the Senate, which are still controlled by the president's party, really aren't looking to go against the White House at any point. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of efforts by Congress to make any changes. I think the biggest area where we may see some action here is at the court levels. They are technically a co-equal branch of the government. And as I mentioned, the IEEPA tariffs, the emergency border tariffs, and now the reciprocal tariffs are subject to court challenges. They're all being I think they're going to be consolidated into the Court of International Trade, which really has the authority in trade matters. So we could see a nationwide injunction, I think, potentially as soon as next week. We did have a trade session yesterday afternoon with ReMA Trade Council, who's been really clued in on that. So, however, the 232 tariffs, though, I think those are probably on the most legally sound ground. So that's where I think the administration is really looking to push a lot of the sectoral specific tariffs. But as you'll see, the third bullet here, it's really about the markets and public opinion that's going to drive a lot of the action from the White House. All right, just a couple of things, and then I'm happy to take any questions. Trade obviously is huge for our members, market access. So what we've been doing is we've spent a lot of time putting together tariff guidance, hosting weekly webinars, linking to any sort of tariff lists and the HTS codes that may be subject to some of the tariffs. So we do have a website here, recyclematerials.org/trade. It's also very prominent on our website. We have a tariff question. If you have really good eyes, you can see tariff questions at recyclematerials.org that we're monitoring. We are going to be getting back to a more regular schedule with these weekly tariff webinars, weekly trade and tariff talks. I do have other responsibilities outside of the federal advocacy, so I will be traveling a little bit, but we're going to get them starting again in June. So if you are a member and want to join that, make sure that you keep an eye out for that. We're also sending out member alerts and communications as to all of the administration's actions on trade. So that's what I have prepared for you. I really appreciate you guys coming. So happy to take any questions. We have a couple microphones here. If you could announce your name and your company first, so everybody in the room can kind of know who you are. So I'm going to go stand over here. I see David. Hi. Is there?
Hello?
Yeah,
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Great presentation. You focused a lot on China, and especially because of the news. The other country that's got retaliatory tariffs with us is Canada. Could you talk about that just a little bit, and if we're going to see any relief on those retaliatory tariffs?
Yeah. So,
and I'm sorry, David Wallace from Huron Valley Steel.
Thanks, David. So right now, the retaliation, I believe, by the Canadian government is maybe 30 billion Canadian dollars, which I don't know, it's maybe 18, 20 billion US dollars. Canada had proposed significantly higher retaliatory measures on 125 billion, I believe it was, which that included recycled materials. Right now, if U.S. exporters are sending their materials to Canada, they are not subject to retaliation on those materials themselves. They are subject, though, to several manufactured goods that may be included in the original retaliation. I think that as long as Canada has this carve out, this USMCA carve out, I don't think we're going to see any of those measures go into place that would bring recycled products, recycled materials into the scope. I do think we will get some sort of deal with Canada and Mexico to reopen, renegotiate the USMCA, the free trade agreement within North America. And I think that will then fully lift all of the U.S. tariffs while the negotiations are going on. So I think that's when we would probably see the retaliation against U.S. exports go.
Just to be clear, so the U.S. lifted its tariffs on Canada as the USMCA, but Canada took some tariffs off the board, but they didn't make this broad across-board thing about USMCA, did they? That they lifted, they haven't freed it. They've got different categorization of it, or? Yeah,
they listed just, I don't remember the number of products, but a couple hundred, maybe 800, 900, 1,000 tariff codes versus like 6,000 tariff codes that were on the review list. Now that review never went into effect. So there's only retaliation against $25, $30 billion, something like that.
It's not tied to USMCA. Is that correct?
The retaliation does not have a USMCA carve out.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Yes. There's a couple of microphones if you could go so that everybody can hear.
Yeah, my name is Subodh Das from Phoenix LLC. For last 4 months, we hear about tariff ad nauseum. Every meeting I go, tariff. But yet, in case of aluminum, we are landfilling 2.5 million metric tons a year in landfill. And we import 5 million metric tons, and half of them just go straight to the landfill. If our recycling rate goes up where it should be, then there will be less need for tariff and there will be less discussion. There will be more productive conversation, more job created. So why is that everywhere I go, all the conferences, technical, business, all we talk about tariff and not take care of the problem that we have created, which is fixable?
That's a good question. I mean, I think from the administration standpoint, it's not necessarily about, they're not looking into the nitty-gritty details of the recycling rate and whether or not the tariffs will help drive one way or the other the recycling rate. I think that their purpose is to stop as much and as many of the imports coming in as possible in order to give the breathing room, give the ability of manufacturers domestically to come back. Now, we have our work cut out for us, as I think everybody really does, in terms of proving their case, proving their cause, why they should either be exempted or why they should receive some sort of special deal. Because so many of these tariffs, though, are broad-based and are universal, it's tough to really make your case when every single industry is going in to make their case. There's not a single industry that's not going to the White House or to the Commerce Department or to the U.S. Trade Representative's office trying to ask, why can't we get XYZ excluded from these tariffs? Because that then waters down the entire remedy. Now, on aluminum, the scrap aluminum is out of the scope of the 232, but it's in the scope of some of the other investigations. So I'm not going to go into that's not really my area. In terms of the better use of aluminum and why it's not being landfilled versus why it is. But I do think that we've had a lot of conversations internally about what we can do to try to at least reduce the tariff rates. So
I think it's our job to inform the administration that if you have the universal recycling deposit law nationwide, then there will less need to have tariffs. I mean, it takes $4 billion to make aluminum smelter, and yet we import high carbon, high cost, high national security. So I think it behooves our industry to tell administration that the focus cannot all be tariffs. Focus can be what can we do with self-sufficiency. If you look at 232, is saying that, well, it'll help us build smelters. But last time it came to, no smelters were built. And actually, only 4 of them are running right now in aluminum case. So results are just opposite what was intended. And recycling rate keeps going down from 45 to 42%, 43%. I think we as industry need to own up to our own problem and solve it and inform that what they can do. But national deposit laws will be perfect. Look at Michigan, 75% recycling rate, and look at Kentucky, 15% recycling rate, and look at California. So I don't know. I think we just cannot wash our hands saying that there's nothing we can do. We can do. We're not willing to own up to our own problem. That's my comment.
Thank you. This is I understand your point, and I don't think we have any sessions, unfortunately, on like on tax incentives or on the tax bill or anything. But I think that's more where those types of conversations are happening, less on the trade side, just given given where the administration is and what their ultimate goals are.
Yes. Hi, James Cooper from W Recycling. Thank you for your presentation. I just had a question. You mentioned USMCA in your discussions or ReMA's discussions with the administration. Have they mentioned anything, or do you get any hinting that they're going to rework the USMCA or revisit that or something soon? Or
yeah, I mean, I think the general feeling is that some of the rules of origin, for example, for certain manufactured goods, for autos, for example, I think that the interpretation of what they thought they agreed to versus what was actually agreed to, for instance, from Canada and Mexico, I think there was some divergence there. We saw there was a big USMCA challenge during the last administration. So I think the goal from the Trump administration will be to tighten up some of these content requirements, that they'll have either a U.S., like a higher U.S. content threshold, not just a regional value regional value content, but U.S. specific, either a U.S. purchasing requirement or something where tilting the playing field in favor of manufactured goods here in the U.S. From our perspective, we will make sure that some of the carve-outs for origination, for pre-consumer, post-consumer, remain in effect. We'll coordinate and work with some of our consuming industries. I know the steel industry is very involved, as well as the aluminum sectors. I think that it's one of the goals. It's certainly one of the goals of the administration is to tighten some of these, especially on any of the third party, some transshipment issues, for example, materials coming through Mexico from China, for example, or even Canada. I think there were some concerns there. Did that answer your question?
Taylor with Greystone Alloys. We process nickel, titanium, and tungsten materials. Your list had a list of exclusions of materials up there, which most of our stuff is on, but we do quite a large amount of weight of nickel alloy imports into the U.S., Japan, South America, UK, et cetera. For example, we had a load come in from Brazil 1 day past the deadline. It's a $20,000 tariff for nickel scrap. Our customers mostly are making aerospace defense products. They're paying tariffs across the board on all nickel raw materials. There's one exemption for nickel other that's not listed on here because it's not scrap.
Yeah.
That's the only nickel code under the Annex 2 exemption. Do you know of any changes or any discussions that are happening related to nickel or nickel scrap exemptions?
That's a good question. The short answer is that everyone is trying to get in and try to get their products or their materials onto Annex 2. The only areas that we have heard of any new additions or new exclusions are those that are going to Mar-a-Lago and really pitching their case and making their case. I know Apple had their materials added to these exemptions. But generally, the administration does not seem to be, their goal here is to get the baseline 10% as the starting point for everything. They're not negotiating away. So the UK agreement that happened a couple of weeks ago, UK had 10% reciprocal tariff to begin with. So it was, in my mind, a little odd that they were starting with the UK. They did not negotiate away that 10% tariff on the UK. They negotiated away the steel and aluminum tariffs, which basically went back to where it was before March 12th, because the UK had a tariff rate quota. And then I think whatever autos are coming, what is it, Land Rover, Rolls-Royce, what else is being made from the UK? So it seems like they're willing to negotiate away other tariffs, 232 tariffs, maybe the IEEPA tariffs on Canada, Mexico, or China, for example. But this list seems to be pretty set in stone.
Okay. Yeah, we met with some ITAC officials specifically for non-ferrous and alloys. And they said they discussed it and they just forgot. It was oversight.
Like
so we asked if we could use the other code, the nickel other code. And they said, if you do that, there would be major implications from customs.
Yes, that I agree with them on that. So this ITAC as in the Commerce Advisory Committee?
International Trade Advisory Council.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're involved in other organizations with conflict mineral or critical minerals because we do a lot of tungsten. So there's a lot of interaction with the government and with us and some of our customers as far as producing materials related to the ban on tungsten from China. And so there's a lot of interaction, but nickel stainless is on the exemption list. Obviously, copper has got 3 pages of exemptions.
Copper is because of it's part of the 232 investigation.
Yeah.
So
nickel and moly are complementary to cobalt and tungsten and so on and alloys, and they're not on the list.
Yeah. The ITAC basically said, so Commerce folks basically said.
Yeah. And that's actually been mentioned now in earnings reports from some of our customers that it's been a oversight left off.
Okay.
But there's no pathway to go forward to get it back on.
Yeah, I mean, the issue that we're seeing more broadly is that they want to add tariffs, add more tariffs, add more products. They're doing this with the 232s for steel and aluminum. They're adding this inclusions process. They're literally soliciting feedback, soliciting products that should now become subject to an additional tariff. They're taking away exemptions. They're taking away exclusions. There's a whole host of reasons why, I think, but also given the government right now, what we're seeing coming out of DC in terms of the federal, the workforce issues and the reductions in forces and DOGE and all of that, a lot of these things take effort by the government to go in and make the changes, to solicit feedback. And so, if there's not a lot of, if there are government officials who typically would be doing these types of things, and now all of a sudden, they're resource constrained.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's
well, I'll follow up with you
tough.
later.
Yeah,
I'm sure a lot of
do you have my email's on the end or at the end of the presentation, but no problem. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello, Oscar Gonzalez, Exim Incorporated, and we are located in Brownsville, Texas, and we service the automotive industry across the border. This administration is focused on putting together this project of tariffs. How do you see future administrations engage with this project?
So the next president, you mean?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's tough because once industries begin to receive these sort of protections, it's really tough for them to move on and to actively and willingly ask for the tariffs to be removed. We saw with there had been a really strong sense when President Biden came into office in 2021 that they would fully either lift the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, heavily water them down. Also, they thought that the China tariffs were going to go away. And that wasn't really the case. They did make a few carve outs for the EU, for the UK, for Japan. But there wasn't really a huge amount of movement on Section 301 on the original China tariffs. Once these constituencies get them, I think they do enjoy having them, frankly. And so you may see, especially these across the board tariffs, if the goal is to bring manufacturing back, and some of these businesses are started or some of these operations or investments take place because of the tariffs. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying, in theory, if a company is using the tariff, like if the whole purpose of the tariffs is to cause companies to invest, the next president, in the event of just a flood of increased imports, of surges of imports because of lifting the tariffs, they may decide to keep the tariffs in place. President Trump has a very unique base, a very non-traditional Republican, non-traditional free trade. It's not free trade. He's really straddled the line between Democrats and Republicans in terms of labor support, in terms of fair trade and the trade laws and duties. It's not, maybe if you get a Ted Cruz as your next president, maybe we'll go back to free trade. But I generally think that some form of this is likelier to stay, just given the domestic constituencies that have come to rely on this.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes.
Hey, Adam. Steve Crawley, State on Fire and Metal. I appreciate your weekly updates you've been doing, and nice presentation today. And I commend you for being up there, pivoting, and being on the stage by yourself right now. Question that I have is specific to shredder consumables, hammers, castings.
Yeah.
We're in a spot where we have a 90-day pause in place, which, if I understand correctly, is we're at a 10% tariff on those items, and then the 20% stacked as well. Is that?
So I should have done this. I was putting these slides together while I was in the middle of the convention, so I did forget to include one. We do have one on shredderware parts. So it's complicated. There is a tariff exclusion from the broad 301 tariff that expires at the end of this month.
End of the month, yep. And that's where I was going to go with this, with just an understanding of what that looks like.
Well, so part of the problem here, I'm going to go back really quickly to this one here. So shredderware parts were added to the aluminum derivatives list, which means that from any country, not just China, if you are importing under, I believe it's 8479.90.9596. Can't believe I remember that. I just write it a lot. If you're importing under that product, under that HTS code, that is now included on this 25% tariffs. So right now, you are probably, if you're importing under that category, you're probably paying the 20% emergency border tariff plus this 25% aluminum derivatives list. So that's 45%. The China 301 is an additional 25%, but that's on hold, hopefully till the end of this month. Now, what we, as I was talking, and I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but what I was mentioning before about exclusions, they seem to be winding down all exclusions for all of their tariff programs. They did it for steel and aluminum. They have not announced any idea what they're going to do with the exclusions that expire in 2 weeks. So my feeling is that those are just going to expire quietly into the night, and we will never hear about them ever again. We've been talking to the administration at, I wouldn't say every meeting, but almost every meeting I've been in over the past 3 or 4 months. I've quietly asked, and the career staff is always saying, we don't know. A lot of what's happening generally with the administration is decisions are being made from the White House. A few people are making these decisions, and they're making them very quickly. So it doesn't mean that I'm not saying it's with 100% certainty that it's going to expire. They may decide a couple of days before, but given, actually I haven't really thought about this. Now that we do have an agreement with China, they may be more willing to simply blanket extend them. My feeling was when they had the 125% in effect as of earlier today or yesterday, in their mind, there would be no need to extend the exclusions because so many products that are currently excluded from the 301 tariffs are instead paying this 125% other tariff, the reciprocal tariff. So it's a de facto trade ban, whether you like it, whether one way or the other, on some of these products, on these materials. So there's no advantage to them spending the time and effort to extend to them if they're just not going to get imported anyway. I know that's a really roundabout way of saying that I don't know. But I mean, does anybody know anything that's happening in this administration or this White House? I don't think so. So, it's my best educated guess is that it's probably not going to get extended.
So based on your best educated guess, if I'm understanding you correctly, when that current, exemption expires, there won't be an impact on the shredderware part tariff because of the way it's being paid out right now. Is that correct?
So it'll stack. So you'll have the 20% IEEPA tariff, the emergency border tariff, then this 25% 232 tariff, and then the other 25% 301 tariff.
Okay.
So you're looking at,
it will stack on there then.
You'll stack,
okay.
Yes, because these tariffs are all stackable. The reciprocal and higher duties, those are the ones that are not stackable. So you're looking at the burden is probably going to be 70%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate the answer. Thank you.
I'm sorry. It's not what anyone wants to hear, I don't think. All right. Any other questions? I know everybody's really hungry. I'm starving myself. So. All right. I really appreciate you guys being here today. Thank you so much. We will get the slides up on the app or on the website as well after. Thank you all for joining.